In this video, we're going to look at creating a login module, uh, but I guess the purpose of this activity is more so to look at things like creating an object library and transitioning between multiple interfaces. So to start with, it's very similar to what we did in project one. So I will quickly do it, but if you want more detail, feel free to go back and have a look at project one. But I am going to create 3 different files here. And I'll go through one at a time, save it in my newly created folder. So as always, we have main.py, which is our main application control. I'm going to create a Kivy file called screens.kv to hold the different screens and the elements within them. And then I'm also going to create my object library file, and I'm just going to call it lib, short for library.py. So we've got those 3 files. To get rid of the annoying error coming up there, I'm just going to put in the Kivy version for the screens. But as always, the first thing we do once we've got our files is we need to build our Kivy application. So it's the same code as what we've done previously. Again, if you want more detail around this, go back and have a look at project one. I'm going to call this login app. Create the build method. And then our if dunder name equals dunder main, dunder double underscore login app dot run. All right, let's just make sure I've done that bit right. I've got myself a blank window. You love to see it. All right, so none of that's any different. Probably the first thing that is going to be different is because we're looking at multiple interfaces. In this example, what we're going to do is use an object called Screen Manager to handle the different screens. So each interface is going to be an instance of a screen object, and we can use the Screen Manager to transition between them. So from our Kivy library, Kivy package, the UIX library, we've then got a Screen Manager library. We want to import both the Screen Manager and the screen objects. They both exist in the Screen Manager library. All right, we're going to have 2 screens. So the first one I'm going to call login screen, and it's an instance of the screen object. Oops. Just going to pass for the time being. And the second one I'm going to call dashboard screen. And once again, just pass that in. All right, so let's save that. Click back on the screen, save that. All right, so we could test it, but nothing's really changed. We've just created these object instances, but we haven't actually done anything with them yet. So let's add some interface elements into our screen, our screens. So starting with the login screen. And this time I'm going to use a grid layout. I know in the previous example we used a box layout to sort of group things in a box. Grid layout obviously groups things into a grid. So what we need to do when we're defining a grid layout is we need to define the number of columns. So the grid layout I'm going to start with has 1 column. But then I guess similar to the previous activity where we had box layout inside of a box layout, I'm actually going to use a grid layout inside of the grid layout. And this grid is going to have 2 columns, and it's just going to hold the text boxes for the username and the password. All right, so having two columns allows us to put a label in alongside our text inputs. So text username for the first label. So then we're going to have a text input object, which allows us to have the user input text. So because we want to access that information in our system, we need to give it an ID. So I'm giving this one the ID of username because we want the username text to go in there. And multi-line just refers to whether the text input can go over multiple lines. Because it's a username and password, we just want a single line is fine. So we then put in another label and another text input. So again, as always, we resist the temptation of copying and pasting because it's the same structure. Gives us an opportunity to spend time interacting with our code and practicing the skills so that eventually we can be as fast as Mr. Lawson. So that's the grid layout with the label and the text input. And then back to our original grid layout, I'm going to put a button in underneath called login. And on press, we're going to create a method that's called login user eventually. All right, so we've added our elements. We've added our screens. All right, so I guess we need to return the screen, similar to what we did previously. Save. Okay, now if we run it, you'll notice that we still get a blank screen. All right, so you might be saying, well, we've added the Kivy elements. You know, we've returned the screen. It's not given us the screen. And the reason for that is because in Kivy, when we have our KV file, by default, it looks for a KV file with the same name as our application. So in this case, I called it login app. So it's looking for a KV file called login.kv. All right, and I did say to call it screens.kv. All right, so it is okay to have different or a difference between the app name and the screen or the KV file name. We just have to add an extra line of code in, or 2 lines, I suppose, once we import the object that we're using to actually identify that file. So the line we need is builder.load file with an underscore, and we want it to load the screen, can't spell screens.kv file. You'll see you get the squiggles. That means we haven't imported the builder object yet. So this one's a little bit different. So from kivy.lang. So generally you can work out a lot of the libraries based off the object name, but the builder one's a little bit different. So import builder. All right, but once we've imported the builder object, it will find that file, all right, and it will return the login screen for us. So we test that now, okay, and you can see that we have the username, password, and the login button underneath. All right, so we will just add in the dashboard screen while we're here. It's not going to have too much at this point. Obviously, if you were building this as part of a bigger application, you would then flesh this out. But let's just go with a label. There's some text that says, welcome user. All right, I guess it's only really designed for us to see that we've successfully transitioned from our login screen, but we will save it so we don't lose it. So guess in order to access these screens, we did talk about the screen manager object. So what we want to do, rather than just return the login screen, is we want to build an instance of the screen manager object. So we'll just call it SM, screen manager, super simple. All right, and then what we need to do is to add the screens in. So SM, which is our instance of our screen manager, we want to add a widget. And the widget we want to add in is our login screen. Add widget, our dashboard screen. So I'll just do that because it comes up. And then if we return the screen manager, it will still do the same job. It'll return this instance which has this login screen widget added. And you can see, oh, you can't see that, it's on the wrong screen. But our login screen, if you wanted to actually test the dashboard screen, now it's not nice and easy. You can just comment out the login screen. And if I run this, you can see it says welcome user. So that's our dashboard screen. All right, I'll add that back in though, because again, the login screen is the one we're mostly interacting with. So I'll save that. Might also just go the dual view so you can see the screens and the main.py. So next step, we've got everything set up. We want to start adding the functionality. So to do that, what we want to do is get the values out of the text inputs and move them into our Python file essentially so we can interact with them. So in our login screen, we're going to create two variables, one called username and the other one called password. And so these username and passwords are going to be what we call an object property, and we give it a attribute of none. So an object property means that we're referring to this text input object. All right, we can't directly refer to the text, but we can refer to the object and then extract the text from it. So password is also going to be this object property. We're getting the squiggles, which tells us that we need to import it. So similar to project one, where we looked at the numeric property, object property is also within the properties library. So object property, and you'll see the squiggly lines go away. So we've created those object properties. The other thing that we need to do is we need to actually create a bit of a bridge between these object properties and the actual object. So to do this, we just go in, login screen, and before our grid layout, before anything else, I just realized I've used the wrong terminology. I'll use the same as what's on the written tutorial just to make life easier. So instead of username and password, we're going to call it user and PWD. And I guess the reason why we're using different ones, you don't have to. You can, have username and password here and here, but it just helps to show the connection that we have up here. So this object property user that we're referring to is defined as whatever the username is in here. So that's why one's highlighted blue, one's highlighted white. Nice and easy. That's the easy way to remember it. But I will use that because that's what I had typed originally. So I've just noticed as well on the tutorial, I haven't done a very good job of ordering some of these instructions, but that's okay. The login user, so that refers to this method down here. So we'll set that up ready to go. So we then want to basically use this login user button to trigger the retrieval of the text. So what we'll do is we will define within this two variables called user text and password text. And what we're going to do is we're going to say within ourself, so our login screen object, we're looking at the user object that we've created, which is just linking, is basically a link to this. We want to take the text out of it. So whatever value's been put in, we want to extract as user text. And same thing with password text, PWTD text. So from the password object, we want the text. And just for now, what we're going to do to prove that we've got it is we're just going to print. So the print will just occur in the terminal. Right? Obviously, it won't happen on the, it's not test, it's text. It won't occur on the actual interface that we've created, but we will actually be able to see the values. So if we run this now, bring the interface across. So if I type in John, password ABC, we press login, you'll see we have user text of John, password text of ABC. So this matches up to what was in the text boxes here. We can adjust it if we want to test. So Johnson, ABCD, you can see that it does change. There's no tricks being played here. All right, so we've successfully got the text in from the interface into our Python code. All right, so now we've got that interface working. The next, I guess, evolution of our interface is to actually be able to transition between screens. All right, and so in order to do that, we're going to use the Screen Manager's built-in capabilities. But just to make it easy for us to reference these screens, we are going to go in where we've added the widgets to our Screen Manager. We're just going to assign each screen a name. So login screen we'll call login, and our dashboard, we'll just call it dash / typing. We all love that. All right, so when we're referring to these screens within our program in our Screen Manager, we're going to refer to them as login and dash. So all we want to do once we're sort of ready to log in our user is we want to say self.manager. So we're referring to the manager of the screen object, which is the screen manager we've created. And we want to set the current screen equal to dash. All right, so it's just saying basically go to the screen manager, change the current screen to the one that we've given the name equal to dash. So again, we can test. We don't even have to type anything in here, but we can just to make sure it still works. We haven't made any other boo-boos, but we log in. You'll see it now transitions to the dashboard screen, welcome user, and we still have our values down here. So everything is working the way it is meant to up to this point. All right, so obviously with our login screen, the whole idea is to only validate user logins for users that are part of our system. All right, so the actual method of validating the user is something we still need to create. And this is where our object library comes in. So I might even just put library over this side so we can still see our main screen. So this is where we're going to create our own object library. And if you think about a login module in particular, it's something that we can use across a number of different applications. So it makes sense to build it once, and then we can use Sorry about that, headset cut out for a second. So it makes sense to take our user object, build it once, and then we can use it in multiple different situations. So this is why we want to create an object library. So similar to creating an object instance in our main.py, we're just going to define our class of object. We'll call it user because that's what they are. And then we're going to have two methods. So the first one is dunder init, so short for initialize. And we're just going to pass for the time being. And verify user is the other method. So basically, when you're planning your project, you create a class diagram. We'll talk about class diagrams more so in Unit 2. But when you're then building your object library based off your class diagram, this is basically the form that it takes. So you create your object. The init function holds a lot of the attributes. So when you create it, you need to save some values about it. That's all done in the init function. And then any methods that you've got for that object. So obviously verifying user is the method that we've got for this particular object. All right, so as I said, we want to pass in, when we create the user, we want to initialize some attributes. And the two attributes that we want to initialize is username and password. All right, and so what we want to do with these is we want to take them from the values that have been input. So I'm just going to create a couple of variables called UN for username, PW for password. And what we're going to do is we're going to add them as parameters for our input. So when we initialize our user, we're going to input the username and password, and then username and password that we refer to within this object, so particularly the verify user method, is going to be those values. All right, so for example, when we take our user text, password text, we're going to pass that in to our instance of user that we create. So we won't do that just yet, but we're going to take that, pass it in as the username and password, and then that's going to store as username and password within our instance of our user, and that's what we'll use to verify the user details. All right, so with our verifying user method, this is something that hopefully we've already spent a bit of time thinking about. We've developed the algorithm and we've converted it into some sort of pseudocode. So I've already done that in the QLearn course, so you're more than welcome to take that. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly type it out here. Again, this isn't really interacting with code, so if you didn't want to type it out, you're more than welcome not to. But just to get it in here nice and quickly, I will quickly type it. So userlist.user, and you can see this is creating all sorts of issues with the Python extension. Actually, I've got to change that. Going off some bad notes. Don't do that. That's annoying. I'll just have to fix it in a minute. Where are we up to? End if. Oh. End the for. And return invalid. Can't spell. Should have probably copied and pasted. So you can see obviously it creates all sorts of havoc. So what we can do with our pseudocode is we can actually use it as comments in our code. So I'm just going to comment all of this out. All right, so this is a really great strategy, particularly if you're new to the idea of converting your code into, converting pseudocode into code, is by having the pseudocode in here as a comment. You can just go through systematically line by line and adding in those bits of information. So to go through one by one, as we said, so for our row in user list is pretty much as you see it. You'll see it comes up with a squiggly line for user list. That's obviously something we need to import into this particular method. So I will add it as a parameter. All right, so we're going to import the user list when we run the verification. All right, and so then we're going to say if self.username. So basically the username that we've been given from the text input. And we're going to say for this one, row 0 and self dot password double equals row 1. So we'll talk about the significance of row 0 and row 1 in a minute once we actually create our user list that we're looking at. So in this case, we're going to return, actually, instead of success, we're going to say true to say we are successful in verifying the user. And way down here, we're going to return a false. So to say that, okay, well, if we can't find it in here, well, then it's not valid. Oh, I forgot the colon at the end of the if statement. All right, but that's our algorithm. So things like else, we don't have to say next row. It will just automatically go back. This is more for our reference of, we know that if it's not true, it'll just go and loop around. So we're not including the else next row. End if and end for, we don't need to. That's what the indentation in our coding is for. So that's why we go all the way down to return invalid. So obviously, if you want, once you've got that in, you can remove the comments. I'm going to leave them in just so that you can see where the algorithm and the pseudocode becomes the code. And now what we need to do is actually call this into our login user method. So there's a few steps. The first thing we need to do is obviously import this object library. So similar to Kivy, how we've imported the Kivy package in, we can just say import lib, or because we've already got an import at the top, I'm just going to add it with a comma. And this is going to import the lib.py file. So if it's not included as a standard Python library, like your Kivy or Pandas is another one for data stuff, it will actually look for a file called lib in your local directory. So that's pretty handy. So we want to create an instance of the object. So as I said, what we want to do is take this information and create or initialize a user. So I'll just put that under the print statements. I guess if we're sort of finished with the print statements as well, we can comment them out. So I'm just going to call it user1 is equal to, oh, almost forgot, lib.user. So from our lib or our library that we've created, we want a user object, and we're going to give it a username of user text and password of password text. So that will then initialize the username and password for this user called user1. And then what we want to do is we want to run the verify user. Oh, sorry. User1 dot verify user. All right, we need a user list, which we'll define in a second. But what we're saying here is we want to run the verify user for user one that we've created and the user list, which we'll define in a second. And if that's successful, so if we return true, only then will we go to the next page. All right, otherwise it returns false. This isn't true, so this never happens. All right, so as I said, we do need to create the user list that this is referring to. And so for now, what we'll do is we'll just hard code the user list. Normally, once we get into the course a bit further and start looking at databases, we'll actually be taking data from the database to generate the user list. But because we haven't quite got there yet, we're just going to look at hard coding it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a list of tuples. So I'll explain what that is in a second. I'll just quickly do the typing first. Let's put a second one in just so we can test different options. So Mary and Lamb. So our user list is a list. So that's the square brackets. And then inside each element of our list is a tuple. So a tuple, round brackets, parentheses, whatever you like to call them, represents a tuple. A tuple is just a list that we can't change or affect in any way. So we could take this user list, we could change the order of, John and Mary. So Mary's username password would be first. We can delete John if we want. But within that, we can't change John's value or the password value. The reason why we're setting it up like this is in Unit 2, when we look at our databases, it will return the data in this form. So it'll form a list of tuples. So each row within our database will be a tuple, and then it will return a list. So all of those rows. And so then the way we process it in our verify user, you'll see it says for row in user list. So for each one of these is what will be referred to as row. All right, we're checking that self username equals row 0. So element 0 refers to the first element. So if username equals John and then password, row 1. So 1 is actually the second element. So some people get a little bit confused, but when we're looking at data structures like arrays, lists, tuples, the first element is actually element 0. So basically, whatever index is being displayed here, add 1 to it, and that'll give you the counted position, I suppose. All right, so what we're looking for is username equals John, password equals ABC. Obviously, if that's false, we go to the next row. We're looking for if username equals Mary, password equals Lamb. All right, so now we've got our user list set up. We've got our call to verify user. We've created an instance of the user object so we can verify the user. I think it's time to give it a test. All right, so just test that it works first. So John ABC, log in, and we successfully log in. All right, that's good signs. All right, I guess we can quickly test the second one too. So Mary and Lamb. All right, logs in. And now I guess we can test some non-examples. So if we have like John and Lamb, so obviously they both exist in those positions, but when we go to log in, it doesn't allow us to log in. So if we just put something that's completely not there, like A, B, C, D, so maybe, it's like partially right. No, it won't work until we have the exact combination, John, A, B, C, then we can enter. All right, so now we have a successful login module. So we can verify users, only allow access if their credentials are correct. Last little bit we'll do for this tutorial though, or this project I should say, is where it says welcome user. It would be nice if we could actually display the user's name. So this is just a practice in actually outputting data from our file into our interface, sorry, this one here. So in our dashboard screen, obviously we want to change this text. So what we'll do is we'll create a variable called welcome, and it is going to be a string property because obviously we want to change the string within this label. So we do need to import our string property. We've already imported the properties library, so we just add string property to the list of things we want to import. And then we're going to define a function called onEnter. So again, this is one that is pre-built. You can see it's come up with a heap of stuff. It's probably a bit advanced for our pay grade. So all we really need is onEnter, and again, refer to self. So we're going to say username is equal to self.manager. So we're going to the screen manager. So from our self object, which is our dashboard screen, we're going to the manager. All right, we're going to navigate to another screen essentially by get screen. And we're going to get the login screen. And we're going to, within that, get the user object and get the text out of it. So if we did user text, because user text is local to the login screen object, or sorry, local to the login user method, it doesn't actually exist as part of the object. So we do have to go user.text to get the user text out of this object. All right, and then we can just simply adjust the welcome message. So self.welcome. So we're changing this string property to be equal to welcome with a space plus whatever we've got as username. All right, and then similar to what we did in the stopwatch project, we say root.welcome as the text. So that'll take this string property, which we've set as welcome plus username. So let's run that. So we've got John, J-O-N-H, ABC. And it still says welcome user. That's because I forgot to save my Kivy file. So it was still loading the old text. Always a good practice to control S as much as possible. And I'm glad I got to demonstrate that it can happen to the best of us. So you can see it says now, welcome John. I guess we can test it again for Mary just to make sure it does fully work. Welcome Mary. All right, so now we've also got output as well as our input from our username and password text inputs. And we've got ourselves a fully functional login module. So I guess a couple of things to sort of go and add from here is you'll notice I had to keep sort of pressing or closing out to get out of the dashboard screen. So you could probably just add a button that's like a log out button, goes back to the login module. And probably something else now that you know how to output text, it would be handy to add a label on your login screen, just basically to give a user some feedback if their username and password is not valid. But other than that, you've got yourself a working login module.